Good evening to my wonderful listeners in America, and good morning to my wonderful Australian audience. And for the rest of the world, hello, this is Toni Lontis on Radio Toni. I'm really privileged to have you here listening to me today. The show is being pre-recorded because I'm in Melbourne in Victoria, about to go on another of my wonderful Walk with Wisdom tours and be speaker on the tour, so I have to pre-record, and I'm so sorry. I miss talking to my listeners each week, but I'm going to try and join the chat room later so that I can answer as many questions as I can. So just a reminder, Radio Toni has its own Facebook page now. So if you want to jump onto Facebook, just type in Radio Toni and send me a like or a hi and join our group. I'm also on LinkedIn. I have my own Facebook page and Instagram and website tonilontis.com, TONILONTIS.com. You can go on and subscribe to my blog or my email. Send me a guest for the radio show, or just send me an email. I'd love to hear from you. So what's been happening in the world this week? I had the pleasure of being on an author's retreat last weekend, also in Melbourne, but this time as a crew member. So as a crew member, I get to help organise the other participants on the retreat and help the novice writers speak out their book in 48 hours. There's an intense lead up to the retreat weekend, and the authors have to complete about 20 hours of prep work before they come away on the weekend. During that weekend, many of them finished books. Some were partway through and some are yet to start, but that's part of the process of writing. There's a flow to things, and sometimes you just need to be in the right mindset to accomplish the work that you needed to do to finish the book. So now they're all in various stages of writing, doing their book covers, going to editing and going to layout before going to publishing. It's a fabulous program for anyone across the world thinking of writing a book. And those of you that are willing to put some time into writing a book, there's lots of programs across the world that will help you do this. And whilst I was away on my weekend retreat, my daughter and grandson moved out again. And I tell you what, we will miss his funny little ways. They've only moved up the Gold Coast a little bit, but we're missing his funny laughter at 6 and 7 of an evening. And grandparenthood is such a blessing. He fills our lives with so much happiness. As many of my listeners know, my son emigrated to New Zealand, and he's enjoying his life as a new physiotherapist. He wrote to me this week and told me just how wonderful it was to enjoy the skiing. He's never had the opportunity to ski before, so finding skiing at his age is tough. He sent me lots of photos of day skiing, night skiing, normal skiing and snowboarding. And he also loves the cold, so he's having a fabulous time over there. So this week I'm in Melbourne again for another retreat that I have to speak on. This time it's with Walk with Wisdom tours, and we are going into the Macedon Ranges outside of Victoria. And lucky for me, there's snow predicted for the weekend, which I'm incredibly excited about. So I'm a Queenslander. We don't get to see snow. So anytime I get to see snow, I get really excited. So we're going to a small town in Daylesford, and it's at the foothills of the Great Dividing Range. And what's it famous for? The small town of Daylesford is noted for the natural springs that surround the area. It's one of Australia's few spa towns. And like lots of Australian towns, it was founded on gold mining. And It's part of a whole area called Hepburn Springs that have natural spring spas that contain 80% of Australia's effervescent mineral water reserve. So the town was originally called Wombat. Can you imagine a town called Wombat? And at some stage they changed the name to Daylesford. So the top 10 things to do in Daylesford are: visit the Hepburn Springs. These 30-hectare mineral springs contain waters high in calcium, silica, magnesium and other reserves. They're noted for their healing and relaxation properties. Also, you can do the great outdoors thing. Lots of walking tracks, falls, lakes, reserves, and including a goldfield track. There's fishing for trout and perch, and it's a great outdoors space to visit in summer or winter. So the history of Daylesford includes its Indigenous people, the Jar Jar Warring people, who were the first people to note the healing and deeply spiritual significance of the Hepburn Springs area. The other thing to do in Daylesford is to visit the history of the place. As I said before, gold was discovered in the 1850s, and now they have a huge number of historical buildings that have been restored for people to visit. Number 4, wine tasting. Don't know how many of my listeners enjoy a little bit of wine, but the Macedon Ranges around Victoria are the finest boutique wineries in the world. They're particularly noted for sparkling wine, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir and Cab Sauv. So that's part of our weekend on this tour. We'll be doing a wine tour. Also popular around the area, and number 5 on the list, is fine dining. There are a number of award-winning restaurants, bakeries and cafes around the area, including a chocolate mill, and I can't wait to go to that one, as chocolate's one of my favourite things. Daylesford is also popular for its markets and shopping, with lots of handmade articles available, vintage clothes and vintage treasures. It's also popular with families, including mini golf courses, trail rides and a maze house, which includes a 25-year-old and a carnival garden to keep the family happy all afternoon. Number 8 on the list is, of course, the day spa, where the 4 local day spas can provide you with anything from massage to facial, aromatherapy, homeopathy, Reiki and plenty of quality spa packages to choose from. A day in Daylesford will not be complete without a visit to the Daylesford markets, where you can see a whole heap of handicrafts, cooking and the wonders of the community. So before I go on, a quick roundup of what's happening around the world in the news. So, you know, we've been talking about Hong Kong recently, and according to Sky News, it's only a matter of time before protesters in Hong Kong punishment. They've been warned that their protests will not be allowed to continue for much longer. Hong Kong has suffered from weeks of violent protests which began as opposition to an extradition law. That law has now been suspended but not taken off the table. Hong Kong citizens are being urged to turn on protesters and refuse to accept their promotional gear or their materials. Police have been deploying tear gas, rubber bullets and other crowd control measures to control the protesters. It's also said that anti-China forces are behind the scenes and masterminding the protesters, who have been openly and brazenly emboldened by these said masterminds. The protesters are still demonstrating would allow Hong Kong perpetrators to be extradited to mainland China. And for those of you that don't know, there's a long-standing history where Hong Kong has been predominantly a British colony and was handed back to China recently. So Hong Kong people are used to certain privileges and freedoms that mainland Chinese have not been afforded, hence the protest. Over to Oslo, where singer Pink's crew and their manager were involved in an aircraft emergency after the small plane they had crashed and burst into flames. The private jet was coming from Oslo to Denmark, following the crew on Pink's Beautiful Trauma tour. Apparently, no one, but it must have been incredibly scary for them. A German medical student has made history after becoming the first woman to win cycling's transcontinental race. Fiona Kolbinger, a cancer researcher, beat 264 other cyclists in the 4,000-kilometre race across Europe. Yay, go girls! And over to North Korea, where they have further tested 2 more ballistic missiles. It's the 4th round of weapons launches in less than 2 weeks. South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff said that the latest missiles were launched from an area in the northwestern region and travelled about 450 kilometres before crashing into the sea off the country's eastern coast. The recent wave of missile tests comes against a backdrop of stalled nuclear disarmament talks from the US and the joint military exercises between the US military and South Korean forces. It's concerning for Australia because we live so close to this volatile area. Over to Mexico, where robbers have seized $2 million in gold coins directly from the mint. The armed robbers threatened and opened at the branch of Mexico's mint and stole gold coins worth $2 million from a vault which they left open. Investigators suspect that the 2 raiders could have had inside help. The commemorative gold coins, known as centenaries, were first minted in 1921 and mark 100 years since Mexico's independence from Spain. And over to Australia, where an Australian woman with terminal cancer has become the first person to end their life under the new assisted dying laws in Australia. Kerry Robertson, 61, died in a nursing home in the state of Victoria in July. She was granted permission to use the controversial legislation which only exists in Victoria, but is in the States after a 26-day approval protest. Her family said she was able to be empowered in death that she wanted. Mrs. Robinson had been diagnosed with breast cancer in 2010, which later spread to her bones, lung, and liver. She decided to stop chemotherapy and radiation treatment in March after the side effects had become intolerable. Victoria's legislation, which came into effect in June, allows terminally ill patients to meet certain requirements and access lethal drugs. Mrs. Robinson died with David Bowie playing in the background, surrounded by her loved ones, and final spoken words were simple and dignified. The greatest part for her family was the knowledge that they had done everything that they could to make her life happy and comfortable, and now she was at peace and free of pain. In Australia, there are certain safeguards designed to help people who are in severe pain. Legislation requires a person to make 3 requests to end their life to specifically trained doctors. The person must be aged between over 18 and must have given 6 months to live. This bill passed in 200 after 100 hours of parliamentary debate. And now it's time for me to take a short break. Over to you, Deb, and I'll be back soon. And welcome back. This morning you're listening to Toni Londis on Radio Toni. And before the break, we were talking about new assisted dying laws. And we were talking about a lovely lady who was the first in Australia to go through this controversial process. So Mrs. Robinson's family applied to utilise the new legislation on the day after it came into effect. Western Australia and Queensland are considering similar laws. In 1995, Australia's Northern Territory introduced the first voluntary euthanasia law, but it was overturned by federal authorities in Canberra some months later. The federal government does not have the power over other states. Laws allowing terminally ill patients to legally end their lives with a doctor's supervision have been passed in countries including Canada, the Netherlands and Belgium. Over to further news around the world this week. Over in the UK, a disproportionate number of female and ethnic minority personnel in the armed forces have been filing internal complaints. The Common Defence Committee report said that the number of complainants, which often alleged discrimination, bullying and harassment, was a serious concern. Some opted not to raise grievances as they had little faith in the complaint system. The Ministry of Defence was said to overhaul its complaints process. In the report published this week, there was no to suggest why for the 3rd consecutive year, female, black, Asian and minority ethnic staff in the Army, RAAF and Navy were overrepresented in armed forces complaints. Women make up 11% of the workforce in the United Kingdom, but 23% of complaints were from women. The minister said that they would be overhauling and looking into the system to see why this is the case. One of my favourite places is New Zealand, and the cows grazing peacefully in the vicinity of New Zealand's Farming Science Research Institute, AgResearch, look much the same as any other cows. They plod around slowly into their pastures, grabbing mouthfuls grass and let out soft, low moos. But some of these animals are not like the cattle you might find on other farms. Away from the view, inside the hard-working stomachs of these cows, an experiment that could potentially change the planet is taking place. All these specially designed, they're not specially designed cows, they're normal cows, but they've been given a vaccine against certain gut microbes that are responsible for producing methane as the animals digest their food. Methane is one of the most dangerous of greenhouse gases and roughly 25 times more potent at trapping heat than carbon dioxide. So this is incredible news research, and if it works, our cows could be having vaccines against methane production across the planet. Over to an elementary school in Merritt Island, Florida, who have proposed a symbol for kindness. The kindy class have gone through the year of the kindergarten and for various reasons aren't quite ready for grade 1. And so they launched a project as part of their writing and geography coursework. So the students are aged 5 to 7, and they want America to adopt a new symbol of kindness. And since its humble beginnings at the kindergarten, it's accumulated over 4,000 signatures from people who are using the campaign to encourage their own state and national legislators to officially recognise the symbol. Once it reaches 5,000 signatures, it will automatically be forwarded to several prominent senators and House representatives. The kindness symbol allows kindness all around, ongoing, never-ending, north, south, east, west, everywhere. Having a recognisable, easy-to-recreate symbol will remind people to be kind. We already have new symbols for love, peace and happiness, and a kindness symbol should be the next focus for national attention. According to the students, their Together Kind website for the campaign presented their proposal to dozens of school boards, city councils and many ordinances across the state. What a wonderful thing for these kindergarten children to do. And it's really sad that we as humanity need to be reminded to be kind. One would think that kindness would be part of our everyday practice. Good luck to those wonderful kids in Florida. Also in the US, for the first time in history, wind energy has accounted for more electrical usage in Texas than coal. What a great job, Texas! The Electrical Reliability Council of Texas, which manages 90% of electrical flow in the state, has released a report that states during the first half of 2019, wind power generated 22% of the state's electrical usage, while coal only generated 21%. In addition to Texas being the largest producer and consumer of energy in the US, they are the largest consumer of coal. Back in 2003, coal fulfilled 40% of the state's electrical needs. Wind, on the other hand, only generated 0.8%. So the Energy Information Administration shows that much has changed over those last 16 years. Based on the data from 2018, Texas now ranks first in the US installed wind capacity and number of wind turbines. The state generated 24 gigawatts of wind energy, which is 3 times more than Iowa, the second largest wind-powered state. Only 41 US states have installed the minimum of one wind turbine. Of these 41 states, Texas has the largest number of turbines, more than 13,000 wind turbines. For perspective, California had the second largest amount of turbines, and they only have 7,600. What a great initiative, Texas. Well done, showing the world the way with wind turbines. And less focus on coal production of electricity. Another interesting story that I read this week was from the Mexican Wall, where 2 professors travelled to Sunland Park in New Mexico and built a Tita-Tota wall into the slated border fence separating the city from Mexico. The set of seesaws allows children from both sides of the fence to play together, all the while still being on their own respective sides of the border. The idea first came to the professors after their international play structure was built in 2009. They succeeded in conceptualising the idea into a book, The Teeter-Totter Wall, and it finally came to fruition this week. There was no advanced planning for participants on either side. It was a unifying act, the professors wrote. And together with this article, there was a picture of adults and children on the Mexican side being seesawed on a seesaw with adults on the other side. It's a great picture and a wonderful story. A little snippet from Ethiopia this week said that they may just have shattered the world record for planting the most amount of tree saplings in a day. The country of India originally set the record for planting 666 million trees during a 12-hour period back in July 2017. But now Ethiopian officials say that they have successfully planted over 350 million trees in a single day. That's a mammoth effort, I have to say. A lot of trees. The tree planting event was orchestrated by Ethiopian Prime Minister as part of his agreement that Ethiopia's forest coverage had decreased from 35% in the early 20th century to just 4% in the early 2000s. And it wanted a legacy initiative to restore the natural greenery to his nation. What a great thing for Ethiopia's Prime Minister to do, and a wonderful thing for the future of our world. Now over to the US, where I want to talk about America's gun violence. There was an attack in El Paso on Saturday that left 22 people dead, and it's being investigated as a domestic terrorism case, with law officials studying an anti-Hispanic document posted online prior to the attack. On Tuesday, the FBI said a gunman in Dayton, Ohio, where people were killed on Sunday, was also following a violent ideology. And they said that they found no evidence that the attack was racially motivated. The shooting at the Garlic Festival in Gilroy was the first of 3 mass shootings in 8 days that claimed 35 lives and wounded more than 50 people. The gunman died from a self-inflicted wound shortly after the attack in California. Investigators found a list of groups from his digital media that may have been potential targets of violence. Officials are in the process of notifying the organisations involved, but would not confirm any names. The gunman opened fire on the festival goers using an AK-47 type of assault rifle that he purchased legally. 3 police officers returned fire, and finally the gunman turned the gun on himself and shot himself. According to US media, on the day of the attack, Legion was urged his Instagram followers to read the 19th century book popular with white supremacists and far-right groups. In his post, he complained about towns that were overcrowded by hordes of mixed-race people and white Silicon Valley workers. The gunman's family issued a statement in the US media on Tuesday apologising to the families of victims and saying that they were deeply shocked and horrified by the actions of their son. They would never, ever condone the hateful thoughts and ideologies that led to this event. And it was impossible to reconcile this knowledge with the son they knew and loved. They will forever have unanswered questions about the how and why this happened. In the aftermath of this event, Ohio's Republican Governor Mike DeWine, who urged everyone to do something, and he announced new measures including a modified red flag law which would allow judges to remove firearms from individuals deemed to be a danger. Dayton's Democratic Mayor, Nan Wally, said that she would tell President Trump how unhelpful he has been during the president's visit on Wednesday to the site of the shooting. In El Paso, the families of the victims had begun to speak out, with one father who had lost his youngest son saying he had forgiven the gunman, which is an incredible act in my book. So let's talk briefly about mass shootings across the US. 3 of the worst shootings in modern US history have happened in the last 16 months. It began more or less with 13, the number killed in 1949 in Camden, New Jersey, one of the earliest mass shootings in the US. Over the next several decades, the numbers went up. 16 in Austin, Texas on a campus in 1966. 21 at McDonald's in California in 1984. The past month or so has been especially brutal, with 2 attacks unfolding in Las Vegas, where 58 people died, and Sutherland Springs in Texas, where 26 people died. They followed a June 2016 assault in an Orlando nightclub where 49 people were killed. The US and around the world has struggled to understand the gun violence, and the analysts have been discussing some factors around these very grim numbers. So one of those factors is considered that the guns are more powerful and that they shoot faster. Shooters have been increasingly using guns with high-capacity magazines, allowing them to fire off dozens of rounds without load. People are being shot in a shorter amount of time with more bullets in their bodies. I, for one, think it's incredibly sad that the American public has access to weapons such as AK-47, multiple shot guns. So the 26 people that were killed in the Sandy Hook Elementary shooting in 2020 and the 12 killed in Colorado that same year both used weapons with this feature. And the data's clear around this, listeners. The numbers of killings in individual attacks goes up with every assault weapon used. So researchers also examined the laws. A ban on semi-automatic military-style assault rifles and large-capacity magazines was passed in 1994. It was lifted in 2004. I think that lifting the ban helped to usher in a new era of mass shootings. With these weapons, individuals shoot faster for longer periods of time, and that allows them to kill more innocent people. In addition, states have their own laws. So after the Sandy Hook massacre, a Connecticut law was passed that banned some semi-automatic rifles. Other states loosened their gun laws. However, in Georgia, a law was passed that allowed people to carry weapons in school classrooms, nightclubs, and other places. Experts think that to prevent gun violence, people in other states must have stricter gun controls. And those states with the stricter gun controls saw less gun violence. Another factor that shows up in the data is that the assailants choose their sites more carefully. The attacks are carried out in places where there is large amounts of people, such as the Las Vegas concert venue with 22,000 people. Types of crowds, the shooter doesn't even have to aim, they just shoot. They do their homework, prepare their groundwork, and that enables them to kill more people. The gunman who opened fire in Colorado in 2012 thought a movie theatre would lead to higher fatalities. Something else that's showing up in the data is that shooters are inspired by their media accounts. Coverage of mass shootings, like the assaults themselves, in addition to journalists' focus on the killers and providing details about their lives and unintentionally contributing to the glorification of these individuals. I'm trying very carefully in podcast today not to mention their names because I think by not mentioning their names we don't give them any of that media glorification. But it's important that we understand the data and the analysis around this so that we can all start campaigning gun control across America. Experts tend to think that the stories do not increase the number of deaths in assaults, but they increase the number of people considering this as a form of making. Another thing that's come up in the analysis is that the shooters compete with each other. God forbid. The attackers at the Columbine High School described their goal as most deaths in US history. It's really a race for notoriety. The bigger, the better, than to be bigger and better than the attackers that have come before you. Becoming famous as a mass shooter is seen a sick glory, yet it holds an allure for some individuals who consider the possibility of fame as something they strive for. It's a grisly fame to attempt. So further to this discussion, former US President Barack Obama has called for Americans to reject language that any of their leaders feed Americans, builds hatred, or normalises racism. Mr. Obama did not name anyone, but his comments come after President Trump's sought to deflect criticism that his anti-immigrant rhetoric has fueled violence. Mr. Trump has been heard recently condemning hatred and white supremacy. However, as President of the United States, it is his duty to the American people to come out stronger and not continue with his anti-immigrant rhetoric. There's no place in our politics or our public life for this type of rhetoric. And it's time for the overwhelming majority of Americans of goodwill, of every race and faith and political party, to say as much clearly and irrevocably. In his presidential speech, Mr. Trump said Mexican immigrants, including drug dealers, criminals and rapists, and more recently he's called widespread anger that 4 US congressmen of colour go back and help fix a totally broken and crime-infested places from which they came. whilst President Trump denied that his comments were racist. From my humble perspective, they seem incredibly racist, divisive. And one would think that the President of the US could do much better than he is currently doing on this subject. So before we go to another break, I'd like to continue after the break and talk to you about a wonderful Q&A with one of America's famous professors and his thoughts on what other countries do with regards to things. And I know from Australia's perspective, we haven't had any mass shootings since we banned semi-automatic rifles after a Tasmanian mass shooting. So over to the break, Deb, and I'll join you after. Thanks. Hello and welcome back to Radio Toni. We were having a rather sombre discussion about the gun violence in the US. And I thought that I'd discuss with you some of the comments by a professor of health policy by the name of David Hemingway. Now, Dr. David, as we should probably correctly, is a professor of health policy, director at Harvard Injury Control Research Center. And he teaches classes on injury and economics. He's won 10 teaching awards as well as an inaugural community engagement award. He's written widely on the injury prevention. He talks lots about firearms, violence, suicide, child abuse, motor vehicle crashes, fires, falls and fractures. He headed a pilot for the National Violent Death Reporting System, which provides detailed comparison on suicide and homicide. In 2012, he was recognised by the Centres of Disease Control and Prevention as one of the 20 most influential injury and violence professionals from over the past 20 years. And I thought with his experience, it would be wonderful to have his thoughts on America's gun violence currently. So in an interview, Dr. Hemingway was asked about how other countries where mass shootings are less common handle gun issues differently. So firstly, he wanted to recognise that other high-income countries start off with many fewer guns and stronger gun laws than the US. And he pointed out, secondly, that often when there is a mass shooting in another country and when everyone's thinking about guns, they take the opportunity to do something with their gun laws. And typically it's a time when countries improve their gun laws, making them stronger and tougher, not solely to prevent mass shootings, but to also prevent other types of firearm-related problems, such as homicides, suicides, gun robbery, gun intimidations, and gun accidents. So when he was asked why shooters be dispatched more quickly and inflict fewer injuries if more people carried guns, this was his response. And I'm paraphrasing here. To many of us that watch television shows and movies where guns are the solution to many problems, the good guy with the gun is a big hero. One huge problem is that so many people in the US are armed who really aren't that well trained. Going to the gun range and shooting a few times does not make you well equipped to deal with violent situations where your adrenaline is going like crazy and your heart is beating 100 miles a minute. You have seconds to make the right decision. It takes good training, repetition, practicing over and over to react in that kind of situation. You can't on the fly suddenly think you're going to be the hero in that story. Instead, you could shoot the wrong person, or you could get one of the police officers, or others who are well trained and trying to figure out what's going on. For most people, unless they're in armed services or a member of the police force, they never encounter violent situations or scenarios. So it's going to be incredibly rare for you to be in a situation where you can actually do something. Do we really want to continuously train millions of people for an event that virtually none of them will ever encounter? Even for something as simple as CPR, training is needed. I was taught CPR 10 years ago, but I don't feel it at all confident that I would really know what to do if I was alone and only seconds to respond effectively. For mass shootings, you would need to keep training over and over and over for the affected. So I guess in essence what Dr. Hemingway is saying is that arming people on the pretext of prevention of mass shooting is flawed thinking, and I would agree. So he was further asked about gun control opponents who have pointed out that mental health issues and violent video games play major factors in the number of mass shootings in the United States. And he was asked if these two things are prevalent here in other countries with lower rates of gun violence. And this was his response. There are a whole range of things that could play a role in prevention, including better parenting, less racism, better education, more job opportunities. All of these things might have some effect on reducing shootings in the US. And we could and should improve all of these things, but the most cost-effective intervention involved doing something about the guns. For example, I can tell virtually all developed countries have violent video games and people with mental health issues. There's no evidence that shows people in the US have more mental health issues, especially violent mental health issues, compared to across the world. We are just average in terms of non-gun crime and non-gun violence. So the professor suggests that the elephant in the room, the thing that makes us stand out as a result, is we have many more gun-related problems than any country in the world. Every other developed country has shown us the way to vastly reduce our problems. Our guns and our permissive gun laws are what make us different than France, Italy, Netherlands, South Korea, New Zealand, and Australia. So I would agree with the professor that gun laws are definitely the way to go. He was further asked, why does it seem many law-abiding American gun owners fear restrictions like background checks, elimination of high-capacity magazines, bump stocks and assault rifles? How would most gun owners be affected by these changes? And the professor responds, the overwhelming majority of American gun owners favour universal background checks. At least that is what they say when they're surveyed. Most favour the elimination of military weapons in everyone's hands. If you ask them whether they feel comfortable with some people in the country having their own guns legally, they would say no. Just as there are some bad drivers, there are also some irresponsible gun owners. The problem is that responsible gun owners have been convinced that there are people out there trying to take away their guns. The US gun lobby has been very effective in provisions that might reduce gun sales, regardless of the effect on public health and public safety. In the professor's work, they make gun owners part of the solution. Some of his colleagues are working with gun owners, gun advocates, gun training shop owners. Together they're finding common ground and developing solutions. The first area that they found common ground in is around suicide. The evidence is overwhelming that a gun in the home increases the risk of suicide. Many people die from gun suicide, as many people die from gun suicide as gun homicide. And the people dying are gun owners and their families. One of his colleagues has helped to get gun shops in 20 states to play a role in reducing suicide. They've had a grassroots education effort which includes guidelines on how to avoid selling or renting a firearm to a suicidal customer. To active gunners, you need the right message and the right messenger, and the right message isn't Harvard or public health professionals, it's responsible gun owners themselves. So what the professor's saying, that gun owners have an additional responsibility to make themselves safe. So the professor and his team are hoping that the focus on working on preventing guns from moving from illicit or legal to illicit or illegal market. The advocates have great ideas. They know about guns. They are big on safety. And there are large potential benefits to get them to work together with public health professionals. And that's the goal of the professor and his team. He was further asked, will it require some especially savage mass shooting to change the political equation? The professor's response says, it doesn't look like any one mass shooting is going to make enough difference. In other countries where there have been mass shootings, enough conservatives have sometimes been willing to step out and say, enough. And this is what happened in Australia. The Conservative, even if we get voted out by our Conservative colleagues, we just can't stand this anymore. In Australia, America, after mass shootings, very few people on the Conservative side are willing to stand up and say, enough is enough. And for my listeners today, if you're thinking about gun violence in any way, it's time you all said, enough is enough. Enough killing of innocent people, enough of gun owners not taking responsibility, and it is a responsibility. It's not a right to own a gun, it's a responsibility. And you should be responsible for your education and the education of others. So further to that discussion, he cited one scenario as a tipping point of the Republican Party to suffer a big enough election defeat. That would be one way you might see real change. There are other ways, and lots of other ways. For example, in 3 states, they are funding gun research, and those states are New Jersey, California, and Washington. They have talked to reporters after gun shootings. Now they call to talk to them all the time about the various aspects of the gun issue. And they've devoted time to talking to particular journalists about the analytics around gun violence. There are many researchers who are beginning to study gun issues, and as that research becomes available to the public, the professor is hoping that more people will start thinking about it in real terms. He's also noting that he's getting journal review articles about guns, and this is good because it means that everyone is talking about guns and the gun problem in the US. He was further asked, what is the one most important thing that you can do? And he said that the professor replied that you can't just do one thing. That's the whole point. It's like asking, what's the one thing you can do to reduce cancer in the US? There are many things. Some might say you could ban smoking, but is a lot of cancer among non-smokers, and banning smoking wouldn't stop smoking. It will create a black market. It's a bad policy. Instead, the public health approach is focused on harm reduction. So if we're going to have lots of guns, which we clearly have in the US, then we have to do lots of things. One of the many big success stories in injury prevention has been the reduction in the rate of motor vehicle deaths. Years ago, he was asked for one big thing to improve motor vehicle safety, and he said, the airbag. The airbag is great, but it only reduced motor vehicle deaths by around 10%. It doesn't pedestrians and bicyclists, and it hasn't been effective in rollovers. Yet overall, since the time when the professor first got his driver's license, motor vehicle deaths per vehicle mile has fallen 85%. And that's because they did lots of things. And if we're going to have lots of guns in America, that's what we need. If we're required to pick one thing that could work and work well, strong background checks is only allowing firearm sales to a licensed owner. More broadly, we need something like the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration for guns, which would address the issue in a range of ways. The professor was then asked if he was hopeful that things would change. And this is interesting commentary. I'm always hopeful. Professor David said he's in public health, and there are many success stories in public health over the years. It is safer than it used to be, thanks to the efforts by people in public health and many others. In so many of these successes, there was strong opposition. When the professor wrote his book about these 64 successes in injury prevention, a book called While We Were Sleeping, in virtually every one there were people fighting against the advance tooth and nail, and yet somehow, over time, things tipped, lives were saved and continue to be saved. In the 1980s, one of the few scholars doing public health injury work wrote that the US would never have seatbelt laws and that we would never have seatbelt use above 20%. Then 10 years later, it was 90%. Things change. Beneficial change can happen. One thing that the professor hopes that will make a difference is that the right federal and state legislators will look much more like the people in the country. Right now, they look like gun owners, largely white, male gun owners. And that's who runs the country, white, male gun owners. The people who are more reasonable about guns are women and minorities and others. But they aren't well represented. The professor thinks that when these changes happen, we will see real changes in gun policies and social norms and real reductions in violent death. So I thought it was an important interview to share with you today when we're talking about gun violence. And so I'll continue on this theme because I think it's really important for Americans. Less so for Australians. We actually feel quite protected in our country because it's much more difficult to own and have a gun in our country. And we don't have the numbers across the country or gun owners as it compared to America. So I want to talk to you about this next little debate about gun violence in America. Every time there's a horrendous mass shooting like the recent one in Pittsburgh or a weekend spree of violence in Chicago, the media commences a few days of wall-to-wall coverage. Large numbers of Americans demand changes to gun laws. The experts debate various reforms on the television. No changes are forthcoming. Attention lags. Next mass shooting. Rinse and repeat. There are two principal reasons why we are stuck in this painful rut. The first is the National Rifle Association, via its influential primary within the Republican Party. It has effective veto power over any gun legislation at the national level and in many states. And the second is that solutions typically discussed fail to match the scale of the problem. And I interject here to say, America, you have a massive problem with guns. Back to the discussion. Banning military-style semi-automatic weapons, regulating magazine clips, closing the gun show loophole, preventing people with domestic violence restraining orders from requiring guns might well reduce levels of gun violence to some extent. But these reforms will not go far enough. They will only make a dent. And this is, there are just too many guns across America. In total, Americans possess 393 million guns, almost half of all civilian-owned guns around the world. Just reflect on that, my listeners. 393 million guns. Half the guns in the world are owned by Americans. Despite the fact that Americans only represent 4.4% of the world's population. In such an environment, it's simply too easy for someone to harm with a gun and to get a gun. States with more guns experience more gun-related deaths, including homicides. According to the American Journal of Public Health, 1%, there's a 1% increase in the state's gun ownership equates to roughly 1% increase in firearm homicides. So, for example, if 2% increase across a state's gun ownership, that would translate to a 2% increase in firearm homicides. States with the most guns also report most completed suicides, which account for a majority of gun-related deaths. This is partly because guns make it much easier for people to kill themselves. Over 85% of suicides attempted with a firearm prove fatal. By contrast, the fatality rate of poison-related suicide is just 7.4%. So that's 85% of success if you use a gun, 7.4% if you use poison-related. If you want to cut yourself or stab yourself, it's 5.1%. Gun violence dropped substantially in the 1990s before stabilising at a rate vastly higher than other developed countries during the first decade and a half of the century. But since 2014, gun violence rates have spiked yet again. So for my listeners, if you think that you have no seat at the table of discussing gun violence, think again. It may be you. It may be one of your loved ones. It may be a child. They may be affected by violence in some way. The chances for Americans to have a link to a gun-related crime is incredibly high. So it's considered that the stalemate on gun legislation will not last at some point, as several times in America's past, there will be a political imperative to make a change. Most likely, the next time the Democrats control the White House and Congress. When that moment rises, wouldn't it be better if instead of debating marginal fixes, there were new ideas at the table that address the root of the problem, and that's substantially reducing guns in circulation? It's not one that comes with my thoughts aren't one that come with deep expertise in gun policy. Rather, it emerges from their thoughts on guns. So in one example I recently, a small company buyout firm purchased an importer of night vision binoculars, a product popular with hunters. The company began to get approached by business brokers about small arms manufacturers that were for sale. One such company was well run, highly profitable, and a rather intimidating manufacturer of sniper rifles. At the first notion of competing in the market as large as the firearms industry, it didn't make sense. They soon learned, however, that the US firearms industry is relatively small. The market capitalises on two of the largest US firearm manufacturers, Sturm and Ruger & Co. and Smith & Wesson, public companies that together produce approximately 50% of all handguns manufactured in the US. That's a total less than $3 billion. To put it into perspective, the market cap of General Motors is roughly $50 billion. In fact, the vast majority of US-made handguns are produced by fewer than 50 of mostly small private companies. So we could choose not to invest in firearms industry. That's a thought. To shift the supply and demand dynamics of firearms in America and thereby reduce violence. And that's a good thought. So sniper rifles are fearless weapons. They're made specifically to kill unsuspecting humans. They don't seriously contribute to gun violence in the US, nor are hunting rifles, shotguns, or truly automatic weapons. The latter is truly automatic weapons are heavily regulated and seldom in civilian hands. Most gun violence is perpetrated by handguns. With the most handgun homicides, handguns are responsible for roughly 80% of those. Semi-automatic assault rifles like the AR-15 and its competitors are in the centre of the gun debate, primarily because of their role in recent mass shootings. But mass shootings make up a small fraction of America's gun violence, injuries and deaths. According to a 2013 government report, a handgun was involved in roughly 2/3 of the mass shootings in the US, including the 1999 Columbine school massacre. The number of handguns in circulation is astonishing. According to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, since 1986, over 100 million handguns have been manufactured and imported into the US. Approximately one handgun for every household in America during this time. To bring down the level of gun violence, perhaps we need to think about having fewer handguns in circulation. And perhaps Congress should consider passing legislation directing the federal government to take 3 major steps. And those would include purchasing the entire domestic handgun manufacturing industry. That's easy done. Ban the import of all handguns and offer cash buybacks for all handguns in circulation. Over time, this would allow the government to significantly lower the supply and raise the price of handguns, all without infringing on Americans' right to bear arms. So what would this look like? It would involve empowering the federal government to buy handguns. Constitutionally, there's no reason why this can't happen. It's doable. Under the law, the government would just have to offer just compensation to shareholders of handgun businesses, and the cost would be quite modest. In many instances, it would not even be necessary to purchase entire gun companies, only the handgun assets. These manufacturers would continue to make and sell hunting rifles, shotguns, ammunition and accessories. Indeed, even at the price of 2 or 3 times the current market valuation, it would be around $5 billion only. I know that's big money for sure, but within the context of the federal government, it's not very much. Then you could bring in smart, highly experienced team of managers from the industry to pull the new federal handgun manufacturing company together in one central place. Maintain brands and models, run some divisions independently, but create efficiencies of the same, just as has been done in private industry. Have a board of directors with relevant experience, continue to manufacture and sell handguns under existing laws to all the usual customers, including national retail chains, independent gun stores and dealers, individuals who pass background checks, federal, state and local government agency checks, and who are involved in gun education. The second step in the long-term solution to gun violence would be to ban importation of handguns, which accounts for a growing proportion of the American market. Of more than 9 million handguns introduced in the US market in 2016, about 40% were imported, predominantly from allies like Austria, Germany, Italy, Croatia and Brazil. Again, there's no constitutional reason why this couldn't happen. In 1989, George W. Bush declared a permanent ban on almost all foreign-made semi-automatic weapons. And in 1998, Bill Clinton affirmed Bush's ban, adjusting it to include weapons that could easily be converted to and from military-grade capacity. Banning handgun importation would require considerable political capital, including new legislation and changes to existing trade agreements, but it can be done. The fact remains that these countries and most other countries who are supplying the United States with roughly 4 out of 10 handguns sold in our country every year and are the major contributor to the gun violence epidemic that the Americans are seeking to solve. So, with that point, I will hand over to Deb and I'll join you after the break. Thanks. Hello and welcome back. And I've been talking so much this morning, I've completely run out of time, but it's such an important subject to talk about and one that's causing the world to talk. So just wanted to go on with the discussion a few points about why guns are so prolific across America. And in a recent article, I read that one of the steps that Americans could participate involves legislation and authorises the buyback of handguns. So it might be a foreign concept for Americans, but gun buybacks are nothing new. I know in Australia that there was a huge buyback after one of our worst mass shootings in the world, and America could do the same. Local governments have been running gun buybacks for years, offering citizens cash for guns that they bring into the police department. No questions asked. There's scant evidence that local buybacks achieved their stated aim of reducing the number of guns on the streets. However, for the simple reason that the gun industry just fills the void by selling fresh weapons. It would be with the overall supply now restricted to an importation and ban and federal ownership of domestic handgun business, every gun purchased through the federal buyback could mean one fewer in circulation. So I just also wanted to talk about part of the reason that some of the other reasons that you could consider across America, and that is buying a gun should be like buying a car. The reduction in US motor vehicle deaths over the past 50 years is one of the great triumphs of public health intervention. Safer cars, stronger seatbelt laws, fewer teenage drivers, the introduction of the airbag have all helped reduce car fatalities. And you've heard about the statistics around that before. Gun deaths have steadily increased since 2009 and now nearly as lethal as car accidents. Lawmakers need to learn lessons from auto safety. They need to put in effect more rigorous requirements for owning firearms. Some measures, like Walmart's lifting its minimum age for purchasing a gun from 18 to 21, may sound good, but likely don't do much to combat gun violence. According to FBI reports, handguns are responsible for 90% of homicides in 2016. Walmart sells handguns only in Alaska. A more effective policy would be to require every buyer at any age to obtain a license that includes all registration of all purchases and at least a moderate training program. Just 7 states across the US require a permit to possess a gun of any kind. So simply by having a license in place, we would thereby make it safer for all Americans. And pass legislation. Not all gun laws are created equal. The military-grade rifles used in many mass shootings dominate political debate. But again, they don't account for most homicides. There needs to be legislation around the handgun sale and ownership across America, and that would substantially reduce gun violence across the country. Did you know that doctors can help reduce gun violence? Let's let them. Doctors can play a key role in educating families about gun safety, particularly when keeping guns out of the hands of young children. Studies show that some 3-year-olds are strong enough to shoot a gun. By the time they reach school age, about 75% can fire a weapon. As a result, the Pediatric Association of America has been asking that firearms in the home when children are 3 years old they think that they're playthings, and they shouldn't be. Children under 3 should not be around guns. So I'm going to have to throw a break again because we're fast running out of time across today. I'm going to throw to Dee now, and we're going to go to another song. Thanks. Bye. Hello and welcome back, everyone. We've had a really heavy topic this morning, and so I'd like to finish off just encouraging you, my listeners, to get involved with the discussion around America's gun violence. And I'd like to finish off this show with some happy animal stories. So in Australia at this time of the year, we have the annual whale migration. And where I live on the Gold Coast, we have a wonderful albino humpback. And he's been spotted making his annual journey along the mid-north coast and up the coast of Queensland. The white whale's migration is more significant this season because Migaloo, a white whale's name, turns 30. He's an adult male and a unique find for scientists. He delights tourists, particularly children, and he's our unofficial national mascot. He's a 40-ton, 15-metre albino humpback whale, believed to have been born in 1989. He typically turns up in New Zealand in late June before cropping up again either along the Cape Byron coast around Byron Bay or along the Gold Coast in late July. This year, as Migaloo migrates from the cold Antarctic waters to warmer tropical temps of the Great Barrier Reef and back again, fans are already on the lookout, and he has already been seen this year, our birthday boy. Reports of this majestic white been reported along the Gold Coast, and everyone's on the lookout for him at this time of year. He's often seen from a plane because he likes to swim upside down and show his white tummy. If you want to track Migaloo on his annual travels, you can go to a site called White Whale Research Centre, which was established as an online system, and it allows scientists and whale watchers to log into their Migaloo sightings. It's a database for the annual whale counts, and it helps scientists keep regular tabs on this rare white whale. Keeping, Migaloo has been spotted over 50 times by whale watchers around the world who eagerly anticipate his appearance each year. It's also reminded that you need to keep your distance from Migaloo. There's a $16,000 fine if you encroach upon 500 metres of him. We like to protect our big boy. Also in Migaloo's family are 3 others called Baloo, Willoo and Migaloo Jr. And despite the fact that Migaloo's turning 30 this year, it's unusual that he has reached this milestone of 30 years, but he is well and truly fully grown and fully mature. So Migaloo is the mascot for the Gold Coast, and we like to mention him, and he's a beautiful whale if you get to see him in the wild, and he's beautiful. Another lovely animal story this morning. College is stressful. Students have classes, papers and exams. They also often have to work to pay bills, and there's lots of pressures from modern life. So in many universities, they've instituted Pet Your Stress Away programs where students can come and interact with cats and dogs and help alleviate some of the stress and strain. Scientists at Washington State University have recently demonstrated that in addition to improving students' moods, these programs can actually get under the skin and have stress-relieving psychological benefits. Just 10 minutes a day can significantly reduce the impact of stress and strain on people. Students in the study at Washington State interacted with cats and dogs had a significant reduction in cortisol. And cortisol is a major stress hormone, so anything that reduces that is fantastic. The study demonstrated the reductions in students' cortisol levels during this real-life interaction, so that rather than a laboratory setting. So the study was conducted in real life and involved 250 college students randomly divided into 4 groups. The first group received hands-on interaction in small groups with cats and dogs for 10 minutes a day. They could pet, play with and generally hang out with the animals as they wanted. Compare the effects on different exposures to animals. The second group was observed other people petting animals while they waited in line for their turn. The third group watched a sideshow of some animals available during the intervention, while the fourth group was waitlisted. Those students waited for their turn quietly for 10 minutes without their phones, reading materials or any other stimuli, but were told that they would experience animal interaction soon. So salivary cortisol samples were collected from each of the participants starting in the morning when they woke up. Once all the data was crunched with students who interacted directly with the pets showed significantly less cortisol in their saliva. The results were found even while considering that some students may have had very high or very low levels to begin with. So the team at the university are continuing the work, the impact of a 4-week-long animal-assisted stress prevention program. Preliminary results are very positive, with a follow-up study showing that the findings of the recently published work hold up. They hope to publish the final results for that work in the near future. So that little story was from University. And isn't it lovely that animals are so positive? So, my listeners, get out there, walk your dog, pat the cat. It's really good for you and it'll reduce your stress. So, over to New Zealand again, where an adorable orange-fronted parakeet is making an impressive comeback from its most endangered forest bird. The little bird has doubled its population with an epic hatch in 2019. It lives in beech forests and was thought to be extinct until 1993 when it was rediscovered in Canterbury, New Zealand. There were only 100 individuals before this hatching season, so this year's bounty of newborns could more than double their numbers to 200 birds. These little birds are only found in a few places where their habitat still exists, a unique upland valley habitat of beech trees. The parakeets eat plants and insects, but when the beech trees produce seed, those become the bird's preferred food source. This year, those trees were fruiting like crazy, producing so much seed that wildlife conservationists hadn't seen anything like it in 40 years. The birds just keep on breeding, with parakeet pairs on their 5th clutch of eggs, so that's their 5th family in the breeding season. Pretty impressive for a little parakeet. The field staff looking after the numbers of the birds found that at least 150 wild-born chicks had hatched so far this season, and they were still hatching. Since the tiny orange-fronted parakeet has the ability to breed for 18 months straight, oh my God, this baby boom might not end when the food runs out. It's taken decades of committed conservation efforts to help this vibrant little parakeet. A captive breeding program has been in place since 2003 and led to 191 releases in the wild over the last 4 years. Back in their native habitat, 62 were released just last year. A crucial role has been played by the Conservation and Wildlife Trust in Christchurch, which has been producing captive birds for release into the wild, and they have now become a breeding machine. It's taken time for the tiny population to claw its way back to a sustainable network. Isn't that a wonderful story? And another amazing story, just before we go, is my guest next week. So, Duffy, and she's written a book called In Heaven on Earth. And I'll just quickly read the back to you before we run out of time. And it says, In Heaven on Earth is a love story played out in the afterlife and the earth life, following one lover's death, transgressing the realms. This memoir recognises the profound grief suffered by souls when parted by death, whilst offering hope, love and solace for those aggrieved. So I look forward to joining you all next week on Radio Toni, and I'll have a wonderful guest called Dr. Annette Duffy with me in my room recording live from the Gold Coast. Thanks everyone for listening. Bye for now.